Okay, welcome everybody to the MYOB Exo User Group this afternoon, coming to you live from the offices of Kilimanjaro Consulting in North Sydney. My name is Kelly Savage and I will be the MC for this session this afternoon. The ultimate aim of this user group is for communication. We have a number of guest speakers who will be presenting to you on the theme of connected business and experiences that matter. But with all communication, it's a two-way street, so there will be time at the end for a Q&A session. You're more than welcome to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen on Zoom, and you can type a message as we go, and we'll get to these at the end. Before we commence, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the main sponsors of this event, Kilimanjaro Consulting and Enprise Solutions, for making this event possible. We would also like to offer a special welcome to Stuart Roberts from MYOB, who will be presenting today. Stuart is the head of enterprise sales. But let's have a look at our agenda for this afternoon. Shortly, we'll be hearing from one of the key sponsors, and following that, from an update from MYOB. Then our keynote presentation on MYB Exo experiences that matter. Following that, we'll hear about some client success stories. And after a quick break, we will hear about MYB Exo releases and industry updates, followed by pathways to the cloud, which sounds a bit like a stairway to heaven. Finally, we'll have a quick peek at MYOB Advanced, MYOB's cloud ERP. We have a number of people keeping an eye on the time this afternoon, so we should run to schedule to enable a Q&A session at the end before we finish. So without further ado, we have the welcome from our key sponsor. I'd like to introduce Ronnie Baskind, who is the CEO of Enprise Groups Enprise Division, which comprises of Kilimanjaro Consulting in Australia and Enprise Solutions in New Zealand. Over to you, Ronnie.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you to all of you for attending this virtual user group. I'd also like to thank all of the teams that have been responsible for putting this together. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into doing it. And that includes marketing, SAMAX, our support teams, our pre-sales tech people, a lot of preparation from individuals as well. And thank you for that. And thanks for allowing us, Kilimanjaro and Enprise, to be the major sponsors again. Our physical face-to-face roadshows have been rudely disrupted, if I can put it that way, by COVID-19. But that's really only minor in comparison to the disruption that you have all experienced in your own businesses. What I wanted to do today is just to focus on some of the trends to look out for in 2021. And this is not really gazing into the crystal ball, because 2021 is literally now only 3 months away, but it's more of an observation of what we see happening in our own client base, of what people are doing, how people have responded to the coronavirus, and what you can do in your business to improve efficiencies. But just as a little bit of a reminder of where we've come from, just to think about how life has changed since the 31st of December, actually, when the World Health Organization said it had been alerted to a cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan, in China. And that was literally 9 months ago. It was really only in March that our businesses started to be impacted by the coronavirus, since renamed as COVID-19. And the Australian borders were then closed to all non-residents. And we started having to live with the social distancing rules, work from home, etc., etc. But we also know that with every threat comes an opportunity, and it's been intriguing for us to watch how businesses have adapted, pivoted, or responded to these changes in the external environment. There are a small number of our clients that have failed, but it's a very, very small number. And generally, we've seen businesses able to use their strengths and to pivot and to adapt to what's changing on the outside. As an example, here in Sydney, there's a gin distillery called Archie Rose, and they realized they were sitting on thousands of liters of pure alcohol. They had a bottling plant, they had a distribution channel, and they had a brand name. And they took those three things together, and they started manufacturing hand sanitizer, and were very, very successful in the market. So you can see how being adaptive has worked for some clients. The other thing that happens is that as time marches on, more information is available, different information is available, and that helps us with our decision making. So these are the numbers as they were yesterday: 29 million coronavirus cases, 932,000 deaths. And that starts giving us a different picture to what we had a year ago when everything was unknown. You can now look at that, you can start making some informed decisions, you can start thinking about what happens beyond COVID-19, whereas a year ago you were looking at what happens when this thing really gets out of hand, out of control. When you are making decisions, the important thing is to base it on information and to be proactive about it. So while we know that everyone's had hardship, we can see the businesses that have responded to this, and many of those businesses using technology to respond to it. So the idea is to gather as much info as you can from as many sources as you can, so the information's not distorted too much, or you get a little bit of a balance. To choose a scenario, select a scenario of what you think is the most likely thing that is going to happen, to put your plans in place, to act based on those scenarios you've chosen, and then to go back and check and to say, I've chosen this way, I've chosen this route, but were my assumptions correct? And as more information becomes available, you can then go back and check on your assumptions. And if necessary, you can then pivot and change on that basis. And the important thing then in any business is when you're looking at scenarios to understand where your business sits in terms of the basic SWOT matrix: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And what you want to be doing, quite obviously, is you want to identify the strengths in your business and use those strengths to respond to what's happening externally, be that to respond to a threat or to respond to an opportunity. So what you want to do is you want to match your strength with an opportunity, or you want to match your strength to counter a threat. Everything above the line is internal to the business, below the line is external. And if you do identify something in your business that's a weakness, you need to move that weakness to a strength before you can respond to the external environment. Because if you try and respond from a position of weakness, without doubt, you're not going to succeed. It's not a good strategy. You want to look for these offensive and defensive strategies, but you don't want to be in a position of temptation or vulnerability. And to use the Archie Rose example, they had some strengths in their business. They used the strength to take advantage of the opportunity. But to use a different example, you may have been a travel agent that decides to make hand sanitizer, and that would not be a good idea because you have no strengths to address the opportunities from. So, I mean, I guess the other thing to look at is what's happened in the environment because of COVID. And we know that COVID has accelerated the adoption of technology. A lot of the technologies we're using today are not new technologies. If you look at things like Zoom that we're using today, or Microsoft Teams, all of these have evolved from technology that was actually around 20 years ago in an immature format. We had Skype, we then had Skype for Business, and everything has evolved. But the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, has accelerated that adoption, and also some of the fear associated with those technologies has dissipated. So let's look briefly at what I'm calling 5 trends. The first one that I want to cover off on is moving data to the cloud. So I'm looking at moving data to the cloud slightly differently to moving your applications to the cloud into a SaaS environment. We'll cover off on that shortly. But just in terms of moving data to the cloud, what's happened is that the cost of storage has come right down. The speed of saving documents and spreadsheets and so on to the cloud has increased. And people are starting to use things like OneDrive, Google Docs, Office 365 in the format of SharePoint and so on to store data. And there's literally no difference anymore between storing locally and storing in the cloud on those sorts of platforms. When I said that as you progress, more information becomes available, this is certainly this is certainly what's happened, and the fear is dissipated over storing in the cloud. And we've all become used to these security protocols, complex passwords, two-factor authentication, where employees are having to use their own devices to receive that second type of authentication. I should warn you here that there are still some very simple scams out there, simple emails asking you for information. Click here to download a document that somebody has saved for you, and just be very wary of those, because a lot of them would contain something like a crypto-lock virus, and we're still seeing that every week where clients in our client base are hit by that. Make sure you've got your backups and you can restore. So this is moving data to the cloud. The second trend is actually moving your services to the cloud. So moving it to, I'll just stick at this stage to software as a service. And when we talk about, a little bit later, Brent will talk about 6 pathways to the cloud, and we'll talk about platform as a service and so on. But software as a service, essentially, we've all got used to paying small incremental amounts for whatever we purchase, be that Netflix or Anytime Fitness or your iCloud subscription or Office 365. And we're starting to see the benefits of, in total, yes, you are paying more, but the small incremental amounts work well from a cash flow point of view. And people are starting to see the benefits of continuous upgrades online for those software. You log into Teams and the functionality is better than it was yesterday. Also, the merging of work and home life means that users are already familiar with the browser. They're accessing their applications through their favorite browser. And of course, working from home means that the division between work and home is merged into a big gray area. And the software as a service makes this so much easier. Susanna will be giving us a sneak peek of MYOB Advanced a little bit later, and you can see how that looks and what it can do for you. The next trend that I wanted to talk about was data. Essentially, data is data. 20 years ago, I worked with somebody that was the chairman of the Society for Interoperability. And I had no idea what that was at the time. I don't think anybody else did. But this was essentially the start of saying data is data. And for the benefit of consumers, end users, customers, businesses, it makes much more sense to have the data in your application open and available to other applications rather than locking it away with some special encryption or technology. And as software has evolved, it's evolved together with APIs, application programming interfaces, which make that transfer of data much simpler. And where we are now in 2021 is that the cost of building that integration, it's still expensive generally if it's a one-off. If it's been done before, the cost is not that significant, but the cost of building the integration is fractional compared to the efficiency gains that you receive. If you take, as an example, a simple web store, and you go back 5 years, the web store was completely disassociated from the back-end ERP system, whereas today, it's entirely possible, in fact, it's very common, that a consumer can go onto the web, order the goods, the picking slip will be printed out in the warehouse, the invoice will be processed, the goods will be shipped, and that can all be done automatically with integration between multiple systems. The next trend that I wanted to touch on is the always online trend. And we had spoken about this briefly when I said that the division between work and home had become somewhat blurred. But I think one of the things about always online that we have to acknowledge is that if it were not for Zoom and Teams, we would not be having a user group over a telephone line. It just wouldn't be possible. And the reason is that humans are social creatures and we want to see each other's faces. We want to see each other's expressions. When you think about it, there's a whole profession called acting, which is about getting you to believe something that's not real by looking at people's expressions. And this is essentially why the boom in online video conferencing has worked so well during the coronavirus pandemic. The next one is online reporting. So this is starting to emerge as a really, really big trend in our client bases because it's possible It's not expensive. There are a lot of tools around, which we'll talk about later, for doing this. And in reality, what you can do is you can have the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which is real-time access across the organization, accessible to anyone from anywhere. And this is done as safe through various online reporting engines, absolutely possible with Exo and some add-ons as well. You end up with a single source of truth, and you adjust your permissions so that the board of directors and the warehouse manager are looking at the same information, but in slightly different views and slightly different levels of detail. And this trend to online reporting is supplemented by the trend to real-time reporting. And if you have a look at this, you'll see that the forecast is that by 2025, 30% of the data that you will see in the global data sphere or on the web is going to be real-time data. And that is a long, long way away from where we are now in terms of printed reports, binding them and presenting the board of directors with a reporting pack 10 or 15 days after the end of the month. And then the next trend that I wanted to look at, the final one, is payments. And in terms of payments, the expression that we used to use is cash is king. And unfortunately now, because of COVID-19, cash is dead. You have to feel for the guy at the traffic lights who used to wash your windscreen, or the beggar with his bowl sitting outside Coles. There is no cash anymore. Everything is being done through debit and credit cards. That trend is going to be accelerated by EDI, PayPal, Pay Now, and all of these sorts of electronic payments. Government sponsored, government mandated. If you think about single touch payroll or payday reporting in New Zealand, those mechanisms of reporting to government have proved themselves. In Australia, the JobKeeper subsidies were reported through the STP mechanisms seamlessly, no problems with that, very simple. And we're moving into an era where all transactions will be reported through these government mandated exchange systems like PayPal. Fantastic for the tax offices in that it gets rid of the black economy, and fantastic for your business in that it improves efficiency. And that leads me into my last slide, which is essentially what we are about as a business. We're about improving efficiency in your businesses through the clever use of creative, innovative, and proven technology. We hope that today you will derive benefit from the user group, and you will be presented with some stimulating ideas on how to improve efficiency in your own business.